Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're so glad you're here today. Sorry for a bit of a delayed start. We're having a few technical difficulties, but I think we are figuring it all out right now. So my name is Megan Maciel. I am the Innovation Marketing Manager at Pivvot, and on behalf of our presenters and all of the employee owners at Terracon and Pivvot, I want to welcome you to our webinar today. We are really excited to be hosting Pivvot's first telecom webinar. We have a telecom expert, Emily Kosmalski, with us, as well as Rob Hernandez from Pivvot, who will be walking you through the different challenges that BEAD funding presents and how together Terracon and Pivvot can help you navigate that. Just a few housekeeping items before I turn it over to Emily to get started. We ask that if you have any questions, please go ahead and put those in the chat while our presenters are talking. They won't be able to answer them as they're talking, but we can get to them at the end. Also at the end, if you'd prefer to talk with them, just raise your hand. There's a raise hand feature at the top of your screen. You can just click that at the end and we'll do some live Q&A as well. We have lots of time for Q&A. And as always, if you think of something tomorrow, next week that you'd like to talk to our presenters, we'll have their contact information included as well. So again, thank you so much for everyone being here. We're so glad you're here. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Emily.
All right, thank you so much, Megan. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides and welcome everybody. Let me know if you can see my screen. I knew that would happen. Okay, can you see my screen now, Megan?
Yep, we can see you.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We're going to talk today about routing and designing your project with environmental avoidance in mind to achieve NEPA success with your broadband grant project. And we're going to see how different design tools might be able to help you, such as Pivvot. So my name is Emily Kosmalski. I've been with Terracon for 18 years. My background and specialty is NEPA compliance, and I have a particular specialty, as Megan said, in telecommunications compliance. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Rob Hernandez, who's going to be our VANA for Pivvot.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rob Hernandez. My background is actually geotechnical. I've also been with the company for about 18 years now, and I just have a kind of a specialty in helping our clients understand conditions earlier in the process than you typically expect from Terracom, which is where we fit in with our site selection tools such as Pivvot.
All right, thanks, Rob. And Terracon is an employee-owned company. We've got 175 offices, 6,000 employees. We've been around since 1965, and we've been hanging in the telecom industry since the 90s. And we do environmental, geotechnical, materials testing, and facilities. And at Terracon, we have a really big culture of safety, and we start every meeting with an IIF moment. We have a culture of incident and injury-free. So for us, the culture at Terracon is everybody goes home safe. And that's our motto. And so for me, I put my why for why I want everyone to go home safe on the screen. Those are my two crazy little kids that, make my life worth living. And everyone has some reason to go home safe. So, just think about that with every task that you have, whether it's driving, whether it's operating a drill rig, whether it's planning a site visit, always think with the end in mind that everybody goes home safe. So the agenda that we have for today is we're going to go over broadband grant funding opportunities that have come around in the recent years. We're going to talk about how NEPA and Section 106, or environmental and historic preservation considerations, get tied into those grant projects. We're going to talk about good site selection and environmental planning and how it potentially saves you time and money. And we're going to review resource impact categories and how each one of them could potentially impact cost and schedule. And then we're going to finally discuss solving what I call the broadband grant design conundrum. How do you design without having a design? And to conclude all of that and top it all off, Rob Hernandez is going to walk us through a Pivvot demonstration and show us how that might work. So in 2021, President Biden signed in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That included $65 billion to provide funds for high-speed and affordable broadband. And the NTIA, or National Telecommunications and Information Administration, is primarily issuing that grant funding. So I've listed out some different programs. They're currently in the process of working through applications for middle mile, for BIP, tribal broadband connectivity. And I know one thing that's top of everyone's mind is the forthcoming Broadband Equity Access and Deployment, or BEAD program. And that's where the 42 billion was actually administered to the states. And the states will then administer the funding to internet service providers, broadband applicants, and others from the state level. And I know, everyone wants to know, what does this look like? How is that process going to work? And I understand, they're building the airplane as they're flying it. There's a lot of unanswered questions about BEAD, but I would be happy to kind of discuss it anecdotally as we go through here. And I would be remiss in not mentioning that USDA has a tremendous amount, about 700 million in funding under their Reconnect funding program. And so that is another great area in addition to the NTIA funding to look for ways to finance your project. So what does it mean when you have federal involvement in your telecommunications project? It triggers what we call the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. And essentially, NEPA is a process law to determine whether a federal action may adversely impact the environment. And it all comes down to the federal nexus. So for any standard telecommunications project, you're putting small cells on a pole, you're building a macro cell tower, collocating antennas onto a rooftop. The FCC license is going to be the federal nexus that pulls you into FCC's NEPA process. For these grant projects, it is actually the grant funding from a federal agency that pulls you into their NEPA process. And what's interesting about NEPA is that while there is, a full set of laws under CEQ federally, every federal agency has their own NEPA process that they have to follow, and they're all a little bit different. So it's really important to understand what federal agency that you're working with, what that NEPA process looks like, and make sure that you're considering that in your project, because a private project on private land does not require NEPA. So oftentimes a lot of internet service providers may have just never dealt with this legislation or this law before, and it could be new for them. So definitely be aware that because of the grant funding, it does trigger NEPA. And along with NEPA comes its sister regulation, which is the Historic Preservation, Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Some people call it Section 106, some people call it NHPA, but it's essentially a sister regulation to NEPA. It also falls under NEPA, as NEPA is an umbrella regulation. And the purpose of Section 106 is to consider the impact to historic properties that might be listed or eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. So that could be archaeological sites, it could be historic buildings, it could be historic districts, anything that could be considered eligible under the NRHP. We have to consider effects to those under the Section 106 process. And it's worth noting within the telecommunications realm that for FCC, there's the co-location agreement and the nationwide programmatic agreement. And those are there to streamline the Section 106 process for communications projects. And in addition, there's now an amendment to the program comment for communications projects on federal land, which is a relatively new piece of law that we'll be using to guide the Section 106 process for some of these grant-funded projects. So we have those to follow, and then USDA follows the NEPA NHPA guidelines and the Reconnect program. But it's important to realize that Section 106 is its own regulation, but it is also a part of NEPA. And so when considering the NEPA process, there's different tiers of NEPA review. The lowest tier of NEPA review is going to be your categorical exclusion. So that might be just a NEPA checklist item. The NEPA screening process for FCC towers is actually itself a categorical exclusion, but other varieties of it might look like a specific action, and you fall within that category of action, and you basically issue a piece of paper saying, hey, I fall within this category of action. But a categorical exclusion could also be as much as a robust environmental report. So I think it's worth noting that with NTIA and with USDA, the CADEX process for those agencies is an entire environmental report. So when you're working with NTIA and you're developing a categorical exclusion document, that is actually a fairly robust environmental document. It involves agency consultation, tribal consultation. It involves considerations to historic preservation and environmental categories of impacts. And so it's not a really short, one-page document when you're dealing with these agencies. And the same with USDA. They do an environmental review report in lieu of an EA when you're at a categorical exclusion, and it is still a pretty full, robust environmental report. For FCC projects, if there's a significant adverse effect identified through the NEPA screen, then that would kick you into an environmental assessment. And the environmental assessment is a more robust document where you outline that there will be some type of impacts, and you outline how you're going to minimize, mitigate, or avoid those impacts. And that concludes with a finding of no significant impact, or FONSI, issued by the FCC. And similarly, USDA and NTIA also would follow an environmental assessment process if they determine that the category of action does not meet their list of categorical exclusions, or there's extraordinary circumstances that push you out of a categorical exclusion. Then you're going to write a slightly more robust environmental document. But as I mentioned, the CADEX document is pretty robust. But you'll be doing an environmental assessment report. It will go out for all the agency consultation. It will go out for public comment, and then they will have to determine whether it's appropriate to issue a FONSI. If you determine through the EA process that a FONSI is not appropriate and there are significant environmental impacts that cannot be mitigated to less than significant levels, then that could kick you into an environmental impact statement. And an EIS is certainly the most robust form of NEPA review that you can have, typically a 1 to 2 year process. And those conclude with what's called a record of decision. So the lowest tier of NEPA review is your categorical exclusion, and the highest level is your environmental impact statement. So on this slide, we compare the typical NEPA regulations and process for an FCC cell tower, to which a lot of people in the industry might already be familiar with, and compare it with the NEPA process for grant funding. So as I mentioned before, the trigger for a cell tower would be the FCC license. The federal nexus for broadband grant funding would be the funding itself. So for FCC projects, FCC has defined that the action would be the tower, access road, associated equipment, and utility easements. But with the broadband grant funding, it's actually whatever the funding will be used for. However you choose to use the funding, that becomes your action. So if it's 800 miles of fiber, if it's deploying a bunch of equipment shelters, whatever it is that action will be funding, that's what we have to consider in the NEPA process. The FCC delegates the NEPA process to the licensee applicants. Similarly, NTIA and USDA also partially delegate the NEPA process, but they do oversee the program, and they do work pretty closely. There are reviewers on NTIA side, there's reviewers on USDA side, and they all have to review and approve your report before everything goes for final approval. And timeline-wise, the typical cell tower NEPA timeline is 90 to 120 days for your generic NEPA screening. It could be more if an adverse effect is identified and you have to escalate to an EA or an MOA. Conversely, on the grant side, you could be looking at 3 to 6 months for a categorical exclusion, and potentially be adding a month or two for agency review and approval of that document. And it would be more like 4 to 12 months for an EA. And again, you could be adding a month or two for agency approval or issuance of the FONSI in that process. And then 1 to 2 years if escalated to an environmental impact statement. The FCC cell tower process takes into consideration impacts to archaeology, historic preservation, wetlands, floodplains, endangered species, wilderness areas, wildlife preserves, and includes consultation with federally recognized tribes through the FCC TC&S system. The broadband grant programs could involve other resource impact categories such as hazardous materials, impacts to sole source aquifers, coastal zones, parks and recreation, wild and scenic rivers, considerations for socioeconomics and environmental justice, radiation, state and federal permitting, and many, many more. So again, it's just a more robust list of considerations for these other types of projects than you might see in that typical FCC NEPA screening. And with regards to tribal consultation, NTIA does use FCC's TC&S system, but they only allow the NEPA practitioners within NTIA to use TC&S. So that's one of the things we're kind of looking for with BEAD, is how that's exactly going to work because of the volume of projects that will be getting pushed through that system. But current process is that NTIA is actually getting the list of federally recognized tribes from TCNS and then giving those to the applicant, and then performing that tribal consultation. And then conversely, USDA uses HUD's TDAT program to obtain a list of federally recognized tribes, and it honestly depends on the state that you're working with as to whether you will be working with the tribes or if USDA will be working with them directly. So the really big things to think about when it comes to planning your broadband project is avoidance. Design with avoidance in mind. If you impact particular categories of things, it can cost you time and money. So just starting from the top, if you are going to impact wetlands, if you're going to fill a jurisdictional wetland or water of the US, then that could result in 404 permitting. You might have to get a jurisdictional determination from the Corps of Engineers. None of those things is a particularly short timeline. It could take anywhere from 2 months to a year to get some of these documents in place. So that's definitely something, if you can avoid it or if you can find a way to design your project around it, it's definitely recommended. Threatened and endangered species certainly could impact timeline if you move from informal consultation to formal consultation with the agency. And it really depends on the conditions of the project and the species that you might have the potential to impact. A lot of species impacts can be resolved through adherence to special conditions or special requirements. As an example, if you just avoid tree clearing during sensitive bat roosting seasons, that might be a special condition that could keep you within that realm of informal consultation. So just try to consider those species impacts and consider ways that you could have special requirements that avoid any kind of adverse effects. Historic preservation impacts, that would be maybe you're impacting a potential archaeological site. It's present within the area that you'll be doing utility trenching for fiber. It could be that there's visual effects to a historic property that's in the viewshed of a resource. Adverse effects are typically mitigated with coordination through the State Historic Preservation Office and federally recognized tribes, and typically would be negotiated through some type of mitigation. A mitigation being some positive impact to historic properties that you're doing to essentially offset the negative impact that you will be experiencing from the adverse effect. And that gets memorialized in what's called a memorandum of agreement or an MOA. And it's typically not a short process. And it does take some time and effort to coordinate and determine what those mitigation will be. And there are certain particular types of historic properties that maybe you just have to flat out avoid. So certainly one of the bigger considerations, and that's why, the EHP process, the HP is historic preservation, and it's just a really big consideration in all of these grant projects. I also added on here hazmat concerns. That would be, digging in the dirty dirt, if there is an underground storage tank that's had a release, if there is a landfill present in the area. Generally, these aren't deal killers, but they are things that can delay timeline. You might have to do environmental testing to characterize the soil or groundwater in the area you're working with. You might have to have a soil and groundwater management plan or some type of avoidance measures for worker exposure protection. But those things do get pulled into these projects as well. And so just another consideration. And then finally, I have federal and tribal land, and I italicized this one because this has the potential to completely alter your NEPA scope of work. This is by far, I would say, the biggest potential for delays in all of these NEPA processes, whether it's an FCC project or whether it's an NTIA or USDA funded grant project. If you have a different federal agency involved, they have their own set of rules for complying with NEPA. And similarly, if you're on tribal land, you also have to coordinate with those federally recognized tribes to, maybe the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, or to determine what the scope of work will be. So now you have multiple federal agencies, multiple NEPA scopes of work, and you have to figure out, where do we go from here? So on an FCC project, we typically have conversations with the federal agency, and we determine who will be the lead federal agency or the LFA with the appropriate scope of work. Sometimes the agency will defer back to FCC and just let us follow the FCC scope on their land. Sometimes the other federal agency will want to directly do the NEPA themselves. Sometimes they will ask that the NEPA prepare, or the applicant prepare the NEPA per their process on their behalf. So there's different flavors of what that looks like. But with the broadband projects, we're talking about miles and miles of fiber. And that fiber might intersect multiple states. It might intersect multiple federal agencies, tribal land, easements. And the more different agencies that you're interacting with, the more complicated it could become. So the agencies could do as little as consult on the NEPA process, give their feedback, and provide a concurrence letter. But they could do as much as doing their own NEPA on the portion of the project that crosses their land. So it's really important to understand where these different federal and tribal lands are located, how they intersect with your project, and start having early conversations. I think people are sometimes a little hesitant to open the conversations about what the NEPA scopes of work are, but USDA, NTIA, FCC, these are agencies with pretty limited resources and a lot to do. So the more that we can do to help on their behalf and have these conversations, make sure that somebody is actually in connection with the environmental review groups at the other federal agencies, you've talked through the project, you have an understanding of what kind of permitting might apply, what kind of conditions apply on their land, what that procedure looks like, and how it would tie back into the overall NEPA for the project. Those are all things that will really benefit you in the long run. What you don't want to have happen is get all the way to the end of your project and find out, oh, well, we cross US Fish and Wildlife land and nobody's talked to them. That is not what you want to have happen. And one of the really crucial parts, and this is what this webinar is ultimately trying to solve, is that the NEPA EHP process requires an accurate project description. So I pulled slides from NTIA and from USDA on this is the type of information that we need to be able to do a NEPA evaluation, because in order for us to assess environmental impacts or historic preservation impacts from a particular action, we need to have defined what that action is. We need to know what the project is, where is it, how will it be implemented, what is the setting of the action, is there going to be cable, fiber, vaults, what is the width and depth of construction, is it in a utility right of way or is it not? Are you going to be funneling cable on an existing overhead line, or are you going to be trenching through previously undisturbed ground? Are you putting equipment shelters in a DOT parking lot, or are you putting an equipment shelter in the middle of a pristine field? Those are all important pieces of information, and they need to be considered at the beginning of the NEPA process. And thus we get into the problem. And it's an order of operations problem, and it's not specific to any agency. It's just something that we've seen with these grant projects. And that is that the process ultimately begins with what I call a partially planned design. So someone has applied for grant funding and they have a route that is getting them from A to B. They generally know where the needs are for broadband and coverage, and that the route in this area is going to meet some specific demand. But they haven't sat down and really mapped out exactly where and how that route is going to get from A to B. And then the applicant is accepted and they have to move into the environmental due diligence part of the project where they evaluate NEPA and NHP impacts. But the problem is that the portions of the project have not been designed, and the actual EPC design phase of the project doesn't come until later. So how do we get enough of a project description that your NEPA reviewer feels comfortable that this is enough information about what and where and how that we can move that NEPA process forward? And in addition to that, a lot of these applications, they consider the needs of what that fiber or the telecommunications towers are trying to fulfill, but they haven't made any considerations for environmental or historic preservation issues. And they find out later in the process that there's a red flag, and that red flag could have been avoided much, much earlier. And so that gets into the heart of our discussion, which is mapping a more realistic design with avoidance in mind. And so Pivvot is a software as a service. It's its own company, and but it works in partnership with Terracon. And essentially what it does is it can help you with site selection, it can help you with making intelligent design decisions, and it can actually help you design a route from A to B that meets all these different criteria. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Rob, who is going to walk you through it.
Thanks, Emily. That was a great setup for what Pivvot does. In a sentence, Pivvot is the leading spatial data and analytics geoprocessing platform focused on providing data and visualizing site intelligence for critical infrastructure. And I think those on the call would agree that telecommunications and fiber are certainly critical infrastructure. And so how do we do that? We're going to give you access to over 100 different data sets within the platform that have been compiled from thousands of different data sources to really help you accelerate that project development and just reduce your overall investment risk. And on the next slide, it's just going to be a kind of a summarization of the data sets that are within the Pivvot platform. So you can see there's quite a variety of what we give you. We've talked a lot about the environmental impacts and the environmental data sets that we have in the platform with critical species and habitat, wetlands and water bodies, NHD flow lines. You can start to look at an early look at your soil conditions as well with the geotechnical information. We have jurisdictional boundaries, energy and infrastructure. And we're constantly looking at different data sets and those that could be more beneficial to our clients to update our platform and continually refresh those based on feedback from our clients. But I'd also be remiss if I didn't say that, it's not just about the data that we have within Pivvot. We also give you, the user, the ability to upload your own custom data sets. So if you have something that's important to your site selection evaluation and your early planning and prospecting, you can actually take that and upload that into the platform, visualize it, and report out on it similarly as you would with any other data set that is within the Pivvot platform.
And I just want to chime in here that one of the really important data sets for this particular scope of work that we're talking about is the State Historic Preservation Officer data, the SHPO data. So that's going to be, the SHPO for each state is the one that maintains cultural resource records. And a lot of times those records are protected, particularly with archaeological resources. You have to be an SOI qualified principal investigator to access archaeological resource data in a lot of locations for good reason. And so what we can do is pull those data sets for you from SHPO and then upload them into the Pivvot platform so that you can access those in addition to. And the same goes with state species occurrence data, any geospatial data that we could get on our own, we could import that into the Pivvot platform and make it accessible. But the Pivvot platform does have NRHP and other cultural resource data already integrated.
That's absolutely correct. Thank you, Emily. And then if we go to the next slide, I'll just give you a little bit of a summary of how we can help you expedite the siting process and reduce your project impact. There's a couple of different ways that you can use the platform. And as I like to tell people when we talk about Pivvot, it's really a create your own adventure. There's no one way to use the platform. You can use it in a variety of different applications. It can be as very simple as just visualizing the data and being able to go to our layers flyout that I'll show here in just a minute and being able to visualize and just see what data, what impacts are within a particular area and identify the parcels that you're most interested in and any kind of adjacent parcels you might want to further pursue. And that's going to help you reduce your overall project risk because now you've got a data platform that is going to provide you with these data sets all in one location. We're helping reduce that overall overhead cost that your company could take on by being able to give you this in one area for you to be able to do this type of analysis. And on the next slide, it's kind of going to just give you just a very simple way that you can look at it from an environmental planning perspective when you go in and actually use the platform. It's very simple. It's as easy as just getting into the Pivvot platform, going to the location of your choice. We give you the ability to either upload the site if you already have it in mind, if it's a linear project or if it's a polygonal site. Just confirm what you want to report out on. And within a couple of minutes, you're going to be able to evaluate those hundreds of data layers and start to generate some of those crossing and impact reports. And I'll show you some of those examples here in just a second.
Yeah, we like to think of it as Google Earth on steroids.
Exactly. So yeah, I mentioned the crossing and the impact reports. So you can start to evaluate those lanes and the impacts along a linear corridor. It also gives you the ability to buffer those locations as well, because sometimes you're interested in understanding the actual impacts along your center line, but you may also want to buffer and look at a particular distance, say a couple hundred feet on either side, just to see if it's going to be within your particular zone of influence. So we give you that ability, and you can actually track and see those locations of those intersecting points and whether it is on your center line or if it's within your buffered distance. You can also just pick parcels that are within the platform as well, and you can just report out on those in an instant as well. So linear, point features, or polygonal projects, and you can also start to run some permitting reports against those particular projects as well, being able to look at those jurisdictional boundaries and understand the types of impacts that are going to be associated, those permits that might impact your particular development. And then lastly, what I'll show you is the actual visualization of a cost surface to help you with your fiber routing. So we're going to be able to open up those possibilities to see where they may exist elsewhere, while still staying within the same relative costs, knowing the impacts to your particular project. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen real quick. And I am going to give you just a quick demonstration of just a couple of different ways that you can use the platform. Again, like I said, it's not really a one size fits all. So there's several different ways that you can go about it. So what you're seeing on our screen right now is a Pivvot siting application. So if you wanted to go in and just start to see an area, right now what we have on the platform here is our energy and our infrastructure dataset platform. So you can very easily come in and just click within a particular area to get an idea of what that feature means. So that power line that's running along the screen here, we can start to get some of their ownership information, some of the voltage information, whether it's actually operational or not, and then the agency and the most recent published date that we're pulling that from. At Pivvot, we are constantly reaching out to our data sources to refresh that every 30 to 90 days. And if they report back that there are updates, then we will put that in the platform and we'll get that in as soon as we know that there are those updates. You can also come over here to the right-hand side for the layers flyout, and then you can just start turning on the different features here, like seeing if there are U.S. federal lands in the area that we need to be concerned about, if we are going to be crossing within that particular area. Some of the other data sets could be critical species and habitat. Do we have an area identified that's already of concern that has endangered species in the area? Because that's obviously an area that we're going to be, particularly sensitive of. We can continue to scroll through. We already have the power line data set. We have parcel information, so you can come in and actually start to pull property parcels and contact information for the landowners in the area. Take a look at the NWI wetland layer, see if there are the potential for wetlands that could be of concern. Flow lines. So there's just a lot of different ways that you can get in here and actually visualize and look at it. And as we talked about those different jurisdictional boundaries, we have land ownership potential conflict where we can start to look through the different agricultural, cultural, heritage, government, hazard information, tribal lands, and so forth. So you can really look through and just see, what of those might be of concern.
And yeah, that one is a particular gem of a layer because, obviously the federal and tribal land is great and we want to capture that, but that also captures things like conservation easements or cultural heritage properties or things, that you might want to capture in a different way. So it's a particularly useful data layer.
It is. And so with the infrastructure and structures data set, we're going to start to plot some of these different features in the area. Emily mentioned that we do have sites registered from the National Register of Historic Places uploaded into the platform. And it's, again, just as simple as coming in and trying to identify what these features are. You can just come in and you can just click on a particular location, and it's going to return that information again on what that feature is. So then if we were to go to that particular data set here, you can see we've got a cemetery in the area. So we have a lot of different data sets that are going to help you identify if there are going to be those potential concerns and where and how to avoid those. So that's just a quick review of just visualization. Going back to Emily's comment on, designing with avoidance in mind, one way that you can do that, just maybe from a tower acquisition perspective, is identifying usable land to start. So within Pivvot siting application, you can come over and you can actually select criteria for what you would consider as usable land. We're not going to want to build these particular structures on wetlands, so we can include that in avoidance. We can include water bodies in avoidance, structures, streams, and rivers. We can start to look at the slope in the area. We can identify areas that are flatter and better suited for the development as opposed to areas that might be steeper and less suited. We can also start to customize the land cover perspective, where we can start to look at forested areas as not considered usable, developed areas, and so forth. And there's a lot of different ways that you can come in here and customize the way that you would view land as usable and not usable.
And you can also create your own categories of usable area analysis. If there's a particular data set that you have that isn't, available like it would be through Pivvot, you can also include that and plug that into the equation.
That is true. Yeah, we have our site sketch feature down here that you can upload those custom data sets and include that in the usable area calculations as well. So it's just trying to be as flexible as we can to help our clients be able to use their data in conjunction with the data that we have in the platform too. And that usable area can be done on a parcel by parcel basis, or you could also just pick a search ring and search around a particular radius. Right here, I've just dropped a point here in the center of the screen. And if I just want to look for usable area within a mile of that search ring, I can just come over here and with the click of a button, I can actually visualize and see where we actually have usable area within certain property parcels. So rather than actually having to go through the process of looking at an entire parcel, Pivvot will actually calculate that usable area for you right off the bat. So now we've already identified now with that avoidance in mind, areas that we're going to want to pursue based on that usable area within that particular property parcel. And it's not going to be just limited to the usable area that we have here. As Emily mentioned, you can actually upload those custom data sets that you have yourself, but you can also upload that into a program that Pivvot has. It's called Aware. So this is all exportable. We can bring this usable area out of the platform, and we can start to plug that into an area and start to actually identify locations that we want to put towers. So if we were to come in here and actually upload that usable area that I just calculated on the previous screen, now we can visualize and we can see the constraint areas and the areas here in red that have been calculated as the usable area. So I've already got a couple of different parcels here that I put in so that we could kind of have them already pre-baked and show you some of the output reports. But it's as simple as just coming in and identifying an area down here that it would be usable, and we can drop our point location, we can buffer it, and then we can run some additional reporting there to see if that might be a particular site that we'd want to further pursue. So we can pick other data sets beyond the usable area, and here's where you're going to actually be able to pull those out of the platform, and you're going to get a very concise summary report in here that's going to give you your location of your tower, and it's going to give you a report out on the data sets that are impacting that location. And these are generated in about 10 minutes or so, depending on how many data sets you put into the platform. But you can start to report out on other features like karst topography, the land cover considerations, social vulnerability index, soils, as I mentioned, and critical species and habitat. We already identified that there was the potential for there to be a critical species in the area. And in the report, it's going to give you a summary of what that is. So now we can see that this particular Tower 1 location that was in usable area before, after a further refinement, we're seeing that we are in a critical species area. So this might not be the best location for this particular site. So how about all of our other sites? Well, we can come over here to our report console, and we can start to cross-compare these reports. So now if we want to look at everything side by side, we can start to select all of our tower locations and evaluate them at a click of a button coming down here through our detailed reports, and start to see which ones are actually within that particular area that we may still want to avoid. So if we look at our critical habitat here and we pull that up, we can see that we've got that Indiana bat that's at the locations of Towers 1 and Towers 3. So right off the bat, we're already starting to identify those constraints that we're looking to avoid, and we can really focus our efforts in other areas that make a lot more sense. So now I'm going to go over here and go to a different account, and I'm going to show you from a fiber routing perspective how this actually helps you from the cost surface standpoint. Just need to get into here. So in the deliverables here within the routing program, what you can actually do with route is apply a relative cost service to the data sets. So that means that if you want to come in and tell the program to avoid wetlands and you want to avoid US federal lands, all the avoidance in mind that you want to actually take into account, you can tell the route program what it is that you want to avoid, and it is going to work to try to find an optimal starting point from point A to point B of where you might want to consider as part of where you're wanting to avoid. And what we're going to give you as an output in there are a couple of different suitability maps. One is what we call our suitability corridor, or you can consider it a heat map, where areas there in blue, the lighter colors, are less relative costs based on the inputs that we put into the program, whereas areas that end up in greens and go to reds end up being a little bit more expensive. So this actually starts to open up a lot more possibilities than what we thought before, because we're going to be giving you the route location that appears to be the most cost effective. That's the yellow route that you see on the screen. But for all intents and purposes, the areas in blue are going to be of similar relative cost. So if you need to start to tweak and move and change the location of how this is actually visualized, you can move that into other areas and know that you're still going to be in areas of similar relative cost. And I think it's a really great benefit to be able to visualize and see that in front of you, and it really helps with that overall project development on being able to just make little tweaks on the fly.
Rob, I think we're getting close to the end here. And did you have anything else you wanted to present, or should I take back the slides?
Go ahead and take back the slides and wrap it up.
All right. I love that visual, though. I love that heat map. All right. So just some closing thoughts here. Hang on. I can operate a computer. All right, so in summary, the considerations to environmental and historic preservation should be made early and often in your design process. The sooner you start thinking about this stuff, the faster and smoother that process is going to be, potentially more cost effective. Tools such as Pivvot and mapping routing data. And I would mention, I'll plug the SiteAct folks out there, combined with site acquisition consultation services, really help create that more realistic design. So that's one of the things I've been doing in partnership is working with SiteAct firms to help scout out equipment locations, shelter locations, along with using Pivvot to do the route mapping. But all of that is a way to get to a more realistic design ahead of the EPC design phase, and really recommended for a faster, smoother EHP review. And to save time, avoid impacts to wetlands, endangered species, and cultural resource as early and often as you can. And another federal agency or any federally recognized tribe, whether it's on tribal land or through some other nexus, we'll want to make sure that we're consulting early to determine what that process will look like. And, don't be afraid to have those conversations. And that's what environmental consultants are for. We can help you navigate this process. So, I'm here to help with any of it. Terracon is here to help. And Rob and the Pivvot team are here to help with design. And so that concludes our presentation. Our contact information is provided below. And so if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Megan?
Thank you so much, Emily and Rob, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. That was such great information. I wanted to give everyone the opportunity, if you'd like to ask Emily or Rob some questions, you can go ahead and use the raise hand feature at the top of your screen, or you can put your question in the chat. And one more thing, we're really excited to be learning more about telecom, to learn about different ways that this incredible infrastructure impacts us. So I do have a brief survey that I'm going to put in the chat. We would really appreciate it if you would just take the time to just answer 3 quick questions for us. We're just trying to gather some more information as well. But again, if you have any questions for Rob or Emily, feel free to hit that raise hand feature, or you can put them in the chat.
If we have no questions, I'm going to assume we did such an amazing job presenting
Yes.
this information concisely that everyone's like, whoo, that's all I need.
Awesome. Well, and again, if you think of something next week, tomorrow, you've got Rob and Emily's contact information. If you forget, you can always get a hold of us. I will hunt them down for you. So
she will.
I will. Rob and Emily and I chat a lot. Oh, okay. We've got one hand raised. Lucas, I'm going to get you unmuted here, and then we'll let you go ahead and ask your question. All right, there you go. You should be able to unmute.
About now.
Yep. Good.
So is this licensing? Is it software, APIs? Can you talk a little bit about the tool and what's the user end, the UE end look like?
The answer would be yes. So yeah, it can be, you can use it as the software license platform. It's on an annual basis, or we also have an API. We didn't discuss that here, but we do have API capabilities if that's something that your company is interested in.
Okay.
Thank
and
you.
then are y'all maybe too much in the weeds? Are y'all partnered with Terracon or separate but equal?
Yeah, so Terracon owns Pivvot, so it's kind of a company subsidiary of Terracon, but we're one company.
Okay, cool, great. I know who to ask a bunch of additional little questions to then. Thanks.
That's right. Yep. And just to kind of clarify, so it's kind of like the hair club for men. I am a user and also, I'm a fan of it. I'm selling it, but I'm also a client at the same time. So I use Pivvot every day, and the more that I use it, the more I really see the value in it, the more it's really making my projects go smoother. So, we're trying to integrate with clients. We're trying to, make sure that we're finding all of the connections of ways that this software can be used.
Awesome. Thanks for y'all's time today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Luke.
All right, anything else? All right, we will go ahead and wrap up. Again, thank you so much for your time. We know time is precious, and we really appreciate you taking some time out of your day to spend with us. Stay safe, and I hope everybody has a great afternoon. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.